There are many influences on news, some of them more subtle than others. One, of course, is the fact that all of the main broadcasters now are owned by huge corporations, which also do other things, which also have interests in other countries. And sometimes the influence is very direct indeed. There was Rupert Murdoch, who, in order not to ruffle the feathers of the Chinese, because he was broadcasting from a satellite in China, pulled news from that satellite that wasn't welcome in China, wasn't welcome by the authorities. So that sort of thing exists in many, many ways. But I think really the most important influence of all is just sheer greed. It's the bottom line. It's your news organizations have to meet the profit margins of your company. And to do that, the corporate owners think the way to go is to dumb down the news, to give the public what the corporations think the public wants, give them more entertainment, give them more fluff. Now, I'm convinced that they're wrong. I'm convinced there's a real audience out there for what I call real news, news of context, news that tells Americans what's coming down the roads, things that could affect their lives, international news that you just don't see on much of the mainstream media now. The mainstream media are themselves to blame for some of their problems and some of their timidity. The mistakes that were made in President Bush's first election in miscalling the shots made the mainstream media, made the television companies very, very careful about the second election, and even any suggestion of questioning the legitimacy of the election. This is the sort of self-censorship that you get, and I think it's largely of their own making. I would hope that independent world television would show us those parts of the world that we don't see now, even parts of Iraq. You know, we only see a tiny piece of the picture in Iraq. Mostly, the reporting is done from the hotel, and then Iraqis are sent out with DVD cameras or still cameras to bring back the pictures and the video. I would hope that independent world television would find a way to get out and cover the full story in Iraq, so we could really know what's going on there. That it could cover the parts of the world that are almost never covered by commercial television. That they could get to Africa, where a huge war is underway in the Congo. We never talk about it. Where there is mass starvation and worse in Sudan. We don't touch that. There are all sorts of things going on that most Americans and most North Americans in general are totally unaware of because they're not reported. Now, I would hope that independent world television could help fill that gap. Much of what the mainstream media in the United States, especially the television broadcasters, gives you is outsourced. It's not original reporting. They use video from the various services, AP, Reuters. They take wire copy, write a story, and then slap their logo on it, put it on the air, and call it ABC News or NBC News or whatever. It's not. This is secondhand reporting. And in many cases, they can't really vouch for it. That's a dangerous practice, and it's very widespread. The spinelessness of much of the media is certainly dangerous for American democracy. If the people who are supposed to be keeping us safe are asleep at the switch, who is there? Who was there to warn the public? That's the role of the media. It's a role that they did not perform prior to 9/11, and it's a role that they performed only fitfully before Hurricane Katrina. The problem of the corporatization of media is worldwide. I mean, much of the world has adopted the American system. I could give you endless examples. For example, most of the French print media are owned by arms manufacturers and missile manufacturers. It's incredible. And there's a very real influence on what can and cannot be reported in France in certain areas. In Italy, you have the prime minister who single-handedly owns much of the media. He controls as prime minister the government-run media, and then he owns a good part of the private media, and not to mention some of the most important newspapers. It's a degree of control that Americans, for example, would find absolutely unacceptable, and it's perfectly normal in Italy. In the UK, you have also a concentration of power, but here you have one exception to the rule. You have the BBC, and the BBC, although it is funded by taxpayers' money and is subject to government control, has managed in most cases to remain refreshingly independent. It did cave in on one big story in which the government was accused of sexing up documents that were used to justify the war on Iraq. But generally speaking, the BBC remains an example for others to follow. I think most journalists would rather do real reporting, that they're tired of fluff, they're tired of entertainment news, they're tired of Michael Jackson and that sort of thing. If given the chance, they would much rather go out and cover the real news, the sort of thing that one would hope independent world television could do. Because, first of all, it's not subject to the usual commercial pressures, and secondly, since it wouldn't take government money, wouldn't be subject to the inevitable government pressures. It's a brave, ambitious enterprise. It's promising to do all the right things. I would only hope that it can get off the ground, and it would all depend on strong, really strong public support.